The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Budget Committee will now begin.
Good morning. My name is Lene Palmisano. I'm the chair of the Budget Committee, and I'm going to call to order this regular committee meeting for Thursday, October 29th. Before we proceed, I will note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the provisions of Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich.
Here.
Gordon. Cunningham.
Present.
Ellison. Osman.
Here.
Goodman.
Present.
Jenkins.
Here.
Cano. Bender. Schrader.
Here.
Johnson. Fletcher.
Here.
Gordon. Ellison. Cano. Bender. Johnson. Chair Palmisano.
Present.
There are 8 members present.
Thank you. Let the record reflect we have a quorum. Today we will continue hearing presentations from city departments on the mayor's proposed 2021 budget. On the agenda this morning, we'll begin with regulatory services, public works, and an overview of capital and debt service. Then, after lunch, we will reconvene at 1:30 p.m. time certain to hear from the Park and Recreation Board, the Youth Coordinating Board, and Finance and Property Services. I will recognize Kim Keller, our Director of Regulatory Services, to begin us with this morning's presentations. Welcome, Ms. Keller. And as she's getting ready, I will just mention to my colleagues that in the meeting chat, go ahead and put your name in queue if you have a question for the presenters, and I will pause them at an appropriate point to run through those. Ms. Keller, are you there?
Good morning. Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Palmisano, members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today to present the mayor's recommended 2021 budget for regulatory services. I'm joined virtually by leaders from across the department who will be available to answer questions with me later in the presentation. If you'd like to reference our entry in the budget book, it begins on page 449. As a regulatory services director, I'm very conscious of the fact that our work has the power to impact people in lasting ways. We are most effective when we are solving and preventing problems. This has been challenging in 2020 when across the entire city, we've all had to re-envision how we work and what resources we possess. And yet we have made progress in important ways that have set us up for this recommended 2021 budget. As you can see, the vast majority of regulatory services funding comes from the general fund, with only a portion of one inspections position funded by CDBG dollars. This is different than in previous years when the department also had a nuisance abatement fund entitled the revolving fund. At one point, a cumulative 33 FTEs were paid out of that fund. Several years ago, the department noted that with declining revenue into the fund, it had become unbalanced and was projected to go negative. Through a multi-year effort involving both new dollars and attrition, the mayor's recommended 2021 budget sunsets the revolving fund. This is a significant step that both achieves financial stability for the department and maintains important nuisance abatement work. In the program distribution side of the slide, you may note that beginning in 2021, regulatory services is moving from 5 divisions into 4. This internal reorganization is a result of years of efforts on coordinating activities and working toward a common vision. This structural change cements this important work and leaves us with 3 field divisions: traffic control, animal care and control, and a new unified inspections services division. These field teams remain supported by our operations and engagement division, and this revised structure sets us up to best deliver on mayoral, council, and department priorities and missed budget cuts. Next slide, please. As we looked at how to allocate our proposed cuts, We focused on preserving the good work the department does, preserving equity gains, and setting the department up for future rebuilding. We wanted the cuts to be strategic and as much as possible in service of a meaningful change. The budget reduction targets are met by 3 overarching strategies: holding most of our vacancies as a department, sizable reductions to our non-personnel spending, and limited layoffs. And so to bring you to this slide here, to understand how we're operationalizing the cuts, it's important to better understand the upcoming reorganization. It consists of 3 components, which are colored in gray. The first is a merger of the housing and fire inspections into a unified inspections division. As individuals, inspectors will continue to do their current job responsibilities, and as a team, we'll be working toward one vision and culture, more coordinated policies, and more cross-training and professional development opportunities. The second change is a new liaison team housed in the inspections division. This change brings together our homeowner and renter liaison teams, where they're currently spread over 3 divisions. And these individuals work one-on-one with vulnerable renters and homeowners whose housing stability is at risk. The third change is a new alternative enforcement team housed in operations. While the liaison team works closely with people on their individual living situations, the alternative enforcement team members operate the programming that both protects renters and holds property owners accountable. Bringing this team together recognizes that work like rental property conditions, TRAs, revocations, and hearings are not really separate programming, but are instead a continuum of services that operate best when they're linked together. Planning this reorganization has taken forward thinking, humility, and grit. I want to especially thank the leadership team from Reg Services who's worked on this: Saray Garnett-Rahuli, Kelly Jones, and Brad Schmoll, the managers and staff within these divisions who are going to make this more than words on paper, and Chief Friedel and Chief Tyner at MFD, who's consulted with us to ensure we are maintaining a strong relationship between our departments. Next slide, please. Our new inspections division is meeting its budget goals by first holding 3 1/4 inspector vacancies, eliminating 2 supervisor FTEs. One of these is repurposed as a manager to provide leadership to our housing liaison team pending a future hiring waiver. So there's a net supervisor loss of 1 FTE. Both the new role and the reductions are done in the context of the reorganization. As our work has shifted, so do our needs. The impacts of the change in this division are complex. We have worked to continue advancing our equity goals, and the reorganization and augmented leadership around Renter First does this. At the same time, there are human costs to layoffs and operational challenges to holding inspector vacancies. Already, we struggle to meet our licensing inspection cycles, and holding these vacancies reduces inspections by an estimated 4,500 a year, almost 1,000 of which will be licensing inspections. We should also expect a meaningful reduction in proactive inspection work, as well as increased response time for habitability complaints. This includes those originating from renters at a time when we plan to see a surge of requests when the eviction moratorium lifts, and as a part of the new expectations for how we respond to complaints at NPHA-owned properties. Our commercial proactive work is not often discussed, but it's also vitally important to the health and safety of our community. Remembering their experience with one of our commercial inspectors, a charter school reached out to them this year for assistance in planning physically distanced in-person classes. The inspector's guidance and connections to the State Fire Marshal's office meant that in their desire to minimize COVID exposure, the school did not accidentally put the students at higher fire risk. This division also has a significant change in the form of non-personnel dollars. We are reducing our fleet by 34%. This is an important financial measure for us to take that will net ongoing savings, but it does come with added complications for inspectors who will need to collaborate differently in order to share vehicles. It's also important to call out an additional non-personnel change that will impact our work but doesn't show up on the slide. The recommended budget does not reduce the funds dedicated to nuisance abatement. However, this is an area where the department is chronically underfunded. In past years, we have made up the difference through salary savings in order to continue delivering services to residents. And in 2021, this tool will not be available to us. So this accounts for a 25% reduction in actual nuisance abatement spending. It is also important to note that currently the contract for boarding buildings is also paid out of the nuisance abatement budget. So the same budget that's going to be contracted. In many situations, the department serves as a pass-through for this service without control of the authorizations. In the past, this has included small-scale emergency boardings that are ordered by the MPD, one building at a time. In 2020, this expanded to also include the boardings related to social unrest. Continuing to pay for all of these services with this common fund will further limit our ability to address nuisance conditions such as long grass and trash piles, and historically neighborhoods with high percentages of BIPOC residents are disproportionately impacted by these conditions. Next slide, please. Personnel impacts in operations and engagement include holding 2 vacancies in our analyst team and 2 position eliminations. With these reductions, we can expect to see extended response times in processing and collection of fees and permits, as well as more administrative work being moved to field staff. This in turn not only decreases the amount of time spent in the field, but also creates more difficulty in ensuring quality control in ELMS since administrative tasks are distributed widely. Holding these positions also impacts our bandwidth to lead on equity and inclusion, both from a data analysis perspective and because we now have 1 manager who leads the community engagement and analyst teams. The department strongly commits to equity work, and it is a top priority. At the same time, I recognize that racial equity work requires sustained time and energy, and this is one place where the investment is more limited. Non-personnel impacts include elimination of our professional services contract that tracks short-term rentals. We rely on this contract for proactive enforcement. We are working in collaboration with business licensing and finance on a cost recovery model through licensing fees, though due to timing, it may not be able to be realized until the 2022 budget. And a reduction to professional development and equity and inclusion funding is another non-personnel impact. As I said earlier, regulatory services is deeply committed to equity and inclusion work, including individualized development plans that tie to performance reviews, regular trainings and workshops, and a very active equity and inclusion team that sponsors and facilitates regular events. We also support professional development to employees and then celebrate their enhanced skill sets by leveraging them and making us better at delivering public service. This work does not have an established line item in the budget, but is funded via salary savings, a tool that will not be available in 2021. A $10,000 cut to this work represents a $40,000 reduction in historical spending. Next slide, please.
Director, I'm going to pause you there for a question or comment from Councilmember Fletcher.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I just want to note that the, elimination of the short-term rental third-party contract is exactly the kind of budget savings that we should be looking for, throughout the enterprise. And it's the reason, just to preview, that we're bringing forward a more robust short-term rental regulation. This is a case where we've been subsidizing that industry because they refused to give us the data that would actually allow us to easily regulate. And so we were actually having to pay a third-party vendor to find out what short-term rental activity is happening. It's outrageous. Everybody should be furious at Airbnb that they haven't been more collaborative with cities as they come into our cities to work with us. And the absence of that data is a big part of the reason that we're going to create a much tighter regulatory environment, for this kind of activity. But this is the kind of thing where, when we're subsidizing an industry and not adequately covering the costs with our fee structure and with their collaboration to provide us with data that they have that we're having to pay separately for, that we need to be remedying it. So I really appreciate you, making both the moves that you are to find that savings in the budget, but then also to work with us on regulations that will allow us to continue effectively regulating that industry without taxpayers subsidizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Moving to the Minneapolis Animal Care and Control. As has been the case across the department, the mayor's recommended budget seeks to preserve existing staff by holding vacancies. In MAC, this results in 1 supervisor and 1 customer service representative role remaining unfilled. Though these roles are in the shelter, the impact of their loss is felt throughout the division, including the field as staff are pulled to fill the hole. This includes a field supervisor now overseeing a shelter team, as well as processing of permits. We also anticipate needing to limit the hours that were available for the public to enter the shelter to either surrender or adopt an animal. MAC has a dual mission of public safety and animal welfare and has worked extremely hard to achieve a no-kill shelter status. We are the largest municipal shelter in Minnesota to have done so. There are also core animal care functions that are mandated by law. And yet over-reliance on animal control officers inside the shelter leaves the public vulnerable to bites and aggressive animals. It also limits the joint investigatory work that we do with MPD and the Bureau of Investigations. As is the case in other divisions, we see that proactive work matters. As an example, when COVID first hit, we stopped doing proactive enforcement of leashing laws for about a month. During that time, dog bites rose by over 160%, creating a lot more work down the road and trauma in our community. Once we resumed the patrol, the bite rates fell back to normal levels. Non-personnel impacts include a $5,000 reduction in veterinarian supplies and a $33,000 cut to professional services contracts. These contracts are for our DNA and evidence testing for criminal investigations, as well as roadkill pickup. Next slide, please. The mayor's recommended budget seeks to preserve existing staff and traffic control as well. In traffic control, this results in 1 field supervisor and 3 full-time traffic control agents remaining unfilled. Often, traffic control breaks full-time roles into part-time ones in order to better schedule around rush hour and events. While traffic volumes have been abnormally low in 2020, holding these vacancies results in a loss of 6 agents and 1 supervisor in the field. Additionally, the 2021 budget does not continue one-time funding for part-time agents that has been part of our budget since 2016. The people themselves will not be displaced because we have additional part-time vacancies that are not being held as part of the recommended budget, but the combined effect of holding full-time vacancies and discontinuing the one-time funding is 12 fewer people, 11 part-time positions and 1 supervisor. There are ripple effects without part-time agents. The first is the number of overall service hours we can offer, since we need to schedule more of our full-time staff during Monday through Friday daytime hours in order to prioritize traffic safety. This in turn affects response times for complaints, which is an already struggling statistic. Pre-COVID, we met our SLA for urgent complaints 61% of the time. The impact of reduced flexibility will also be felt by our partner departments and agencies. Traffic control have served as an ancillary education body and a visual presence during COVID-19, including education for restaurant closures and social distancing in public areas. They also worked alongside MFD, MPD, and Public Works to help clean up inoperable vehicles and restore parking compliance after the summer's uprising. As we work to understand the equity impacts of our budget decisions, it's critical to recognize that there are internal impacts as well as those felt by the community. Traffic control is a division that is 60% BIPOC. Being BIPOC and in uniform brings with it extra psychological toll, especially in 2020. These staff need to have flexibility, enough flexibility in their scheduling to allow for 2 days off in a row and time between tough calls to reset and bring their best to our residents. Historically, we have not always been able to make this happen. And I and the traffic control management team are very cognizant of burnout and turnover. The only non-personnel reductions for traffic control as part of the mayor's recommended budget are in the form of cost allocation or internal charges, and these reductions should not affect our operations. Next slide, please.
Director, if I may briefly, just pause for a second. I so appreciate that you named who the people are that work in traffic control and the kind of toll that this past year has taken on them. I can't think of too many other types of roles in our city that where their work has changed quite so much due to COVID and the summer and civil unrest. It is a tough time and there are not easy cuts anywhere. But this traffic control division, I was curious if you could just spend 10 more seconds telling us a little bit more about how dramatically they've shifted roles, because they also, this team, are very they're very changeable, right? Like, meaning like they can go and do so many other things that help us contain situations or restart situations, and to fill in places where all of a sudden COVID has really changed the way that we operate in the logistics of our city. Did you want to mention, could you mention a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Chair Palmisano. So traffic control agents, their traditional duties really are around traffic flow and making sure people are safe on the streets in terms of traffic flow and parking enforcement. With their training and the fact that they are in their vehicles and they're out, we have been as a city able to really utilize them in creative ways. A couple of those that I mentioned earlier were around the education for restaurants when we were doing restaurant and bar closures. They have gone out and done soft enforcement when there was limitations on parks and number of people in parks and congregating. They helped out internally for us with leashing concerns as well, and being able to do, again, soft enforcement in those sorts of circumstances and education. There's been some limitations to what they can do, as well as I talked about those safety concerns in terms of being in certain parts of the city and in certain days and times of the day, making sure that they are paired up and that there's enough redundancy that they can be in the field and feel comfortable as they're in the field. And so the work really has changed, as you alluded to, and being able to fill in gaps where other departments have needed them.
Thank you. Councilmember Jenkins and then Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director Keller, I just want to acknowledge my gratitude for you naming these real and significant challenges as well, as being BIPOC or Black and Indigenous or Brown people of color, and the challenges of fulfilling our duties that we have signed up for and been assigned to, but at the same time struggling with the challenges of racial inequities in our society and quite frankly in our city structures as well. And I think naming that is a step towards changing the culture in our city and recognizing that these employees have an extra burden of trying to fulfill their responsibilities and continuing to uphold justice. So I just want to thank you for naming that and for modeling that for other departments to recognize. And I've personally been having a hard time stating that myself. And so you stated it quite eloquently, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to get some clarity, and I know that I can find it in one of the financial charts, but I haven't got there yet, about the staffing for traffic control. I understand what you told us is that there will be no layoffs because we're able to just be holding positions that are currently still open. So it sounds like that's really going to kind of strain our capacity quite a bit, especially if we wanted traffic control to handle any additional work. That's really going to put a strain on everybody. Could you just tell me the total number of traffic control agents that we now have? And then I think it'll be pretty clear we are holding 4 full-time positions open, but how many do we have right now?
Sure. So through the chair, Councilmember Gordon, you would think that it's an easy answer, but because we fill so many of the full-time positions with part-time staff, the budget book and the finance and the HR systems sometimes don't. There's a little bit of crosswalk that needs to be made between them. So budgeted FTEs in 2020 were 48 in that division, and that includes the agents on the ground as well as supervisors, managers, leads, and the support work that they have around them. The 2020, we have some funded agents, 5 part-time agents that are funded on one-time dollars in 2020 that are not funded they're not funded in 2021. So I think a way to think about this is what is kind of our percentage of our 2020 budget that we can expect to see on the ground in 2021, and it's about 90% of where we were. The 90% in terms of actual people. The hours becomes more complicated again because of that loss of the part-timers really are what provide us the flexibility to traditionally be able to work 7 days a week and Monday through Friday to be able to start at 7 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning and go until 11 o'clock at night on 48 FTEs. So when we have 11 fewer part-time agents, we're going to see contractions in the hours that we can provide as well.
So we have 48 now, and we are not. I'm not sure how many of those are actual agents, but that's right. 48 divided into those 3 categories you talked about. And in 2021, we're going to lose 2 because one time, what's 90%?
Sure. So in 2021, we are holding 3 specialist vacancies, which we would have filled with 6 part-time people. So, and 1 supervisor full-time. And then we're also losing an additional 5 part-timers who were funded on one-time dollars. So it's a total of 12 people, 11 of whom would have been in the field.
So we're going down to 36.
Happy to send this to you separately if you like. I understand that it is, as I talked about, there's a crosswalk that needs to happen. It is a complicated.
Yes, it almost feels like then there might be some layoffs occurring.
Because of additional vacancies that we have, we can transition the actual people. But we cannot, that the vacancies that we're not anticipating holding in 2021 that we would be submitting hiring waivers for if it's needed. But we would be able to, so we'd be able to transition the people, but then we have other roles that are going away. It's a complicated funding model, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I'll look into it and maybe you can send me some information too, because it sounds like we're losing 12 agents the way you said it at one point. So our full-time equivalents will not be 48 in 2021.
Yes, in terms of what we have available on the ground. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'd be interested in seeing how we could help fill some of those if at all possible, but and not make the cuts this dramatic necessarily in this division. So any more information you could give me would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're done. Director, if you want to move on to the next section, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so in 2020, we focused on our core work and further integrated our renter first work. The new investment outlined in the following slide helps to further that work. If you would please advance to the next slide. So there is one change item as part of the mayor's recommended budget for regulatory services, and it is to reinstate a vehicle that was part of the adopted 2020 budget, but then removed in the revised budget. So the adopted 2020 budget, the original one, included a rental housing liaison and an associated vehicle. The work of rental housing liaisons, or tenant navigators as they're referred to in the budget book, is extremely relational. They are less able to rely on virtual means of connection than other inspectors. And so while these roles do share in the fleet reduction along with their colleagues, this vehicle recognizes the special needs of these roles. It also provides for greater flexibility in scheduling, which is especially valuable with residents whose availability is either very limited or unplanned. Next slide, please.
If I could pause, well, it looks like this is the last slide. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much, Director, for this presentation. I know that the Reg Services Department has faced this very large structural budget issue at the same time that now our city is going through increased demands and decreased budgets. So just appreciate your leadership and creativity and thoughtfulness. I've never met with you without having a smart sheet situation with everything very planned and thought out, and I so appreciate it. I want to reflect on the way that the renter first policy is reflected in this budget proposal and really appreciate that. I think when we started out with that idea, which is modeled after our complete streets policy and the work that the Public Works Department has done to restructure, redirect work, really transform how they're thinking about their work under the leadership of Chair Reich and others, Councilmember Gordon, and some of us new folks who came in to help support that work. And I really think, this doesn't grab headlines. It's maybe boring sounding to a lot of folks, but restructuring our city's government to better deliver services and to meet goals like race equity, like housing stability, like making sure that 52% of people in our city who rent their homes are safe and supported is so important. And I just see it, throughout the thread of this work. And of course, not just renters, but all of the folks in our city who need support now more than ever. So just deep appreciation for the creativity of your team. We've heard many times the example from animal care and control around supporting folks who are experiencing domestic violence in their home. Just so many examples from this team that could seem very, cut and dry, regulating, enforcing rules, is really bringing so much creativity and thought to the work. And Councilmember Ellison and I had a chance to meet with your team when we were developing the Renter First policy and to talk about our real commitment to supporting this department through a time of change, through reprioritization. So that commitment stands. I just appreciate your work so much and that of your team.
Thank you, Council President.
Thank you. I think that, that really speaks for all of us when we say we appreciate all of the different aspects of Reg Services and how you're really moving things around to meet our needs as best possible. It is never a good position to be in when we are in a budget with a lot of cuts where every department has to feel that. But thank you for all of this thoughtful work that you've put in to determining next year's budget proposal. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions from my colleagues at this time. So thank you, Director Keller. And we will move on. We're going to switch gears now and invite Director Hutchison for this next part of the presentation. Director Hutchison leads Public Works, and I will mention that shortly after we started today, we were joined by Councilmember Ellison. Thank you for being here. Director Hutchison, are you out there and available to start us off?
Good morning, Chair Palmisano. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Excellent. Good morning, Chair Palmisano, members of the Budget Committee. I am very pleased to be here this morning to present the Mayor's recommended 2021 budget for Public Works. I always start my presentation by recognizing the team that surrounds me in the development and execution of the budget and all of its related programs. So before I go any further, I want to recognize that I'm joined today by Deputy Directors Brett Jelly and Brian Dodds, who's also our city engineer, and our division directors Jenny Hager, Don Elwood, John Wirchus, Mike Kennedy, Glenn Garrett's, Annika Bankston, who is the assistant to Glenn, Stephanie Johnson, Dave Herberholz, and Al Thunberg. I want to express my appreciation for the work of the budget team, both internal to Public Works, led by Vicki Stone, as well as I want to say a huge thanks to the Budget Office, who's navigated an incredibly challenging year, which is an understatement. This budget presentation is going to be a little different than all previous presentations that I have made to this body. And today we're really focusing on how Public Works will adapt to a smaller general fund budget. And this presentation will express the ways we'll both mitigate the effects of a smaller general fund budget, as well as be honest and transparent about where we anticipate seeing a reduced level of service that may be felt by our community. There's another way that I want to recognize the work of all of our division directors and the budget offices, and that is that they've worked through each of our programs to find the least impactful means of reducing our budget. And I mean for both our internal staff doing the work, as well as to what our public may be feeling. That was very detailed work. And I'll explain in each program area how we're going to try to reduce the impacts of a smaller general fund budget. And you can go to the summary chart. Thank you. Whoever's doing the slides, good on the anticipation. So I'll begin with just a reminder of the financial and services structure of Public Works. On the left-hand side of the screen is a breakdown of the types of funds that are drawn upon for various types of activities. The largest portion of Public Works budget is in the enterprise funds, and that includes our utility funds of water, surface water and sewer, solid waste recycling, as well as the parking fund. This is almost 2/3 of the entire budget. I call that out because often we look at the Public Works budget and we think, wow, that's real big, and it is. But only a portion of that is general fund or other funds that we're really able to work within when we're looking at budget reductions. On the right is a breakdown of the numerous programs and activities that we have within Public Works. The largest program area is sanitary sewer, followed by water treatment and distribution. And we have a breakdown of all of our programs here, and I'll be focusing on the general fund programs today. I'll also be presenting our utility, our rate proposal for 2021 at the end of this presentation. Most of this presentation is going to focus on base cuts. We do not have any, within the recommended budget, there are no new items to propose. So I'll begin the description of the base cuts by starting with our Public Works Administration team, which, as a quick reminder, also includes the entire safety program for the department, which is necessary, important, legally necessary and important function to any field operation. A little bit of a structural explanation here, which I'm guessing you've heard from each of the presentations so far, but just in case not. Reductions are inclusive of personnel, allocations, and non-personnel. Most of what I'm going to talk about are in personnel, a little bit of non-personnel, and the allocation is simply the funds that go towards the support network for all of our departments, including HR or rent. I'm not going to talk much about allocation, but you'll see that it is reduced across all of our program areas. Within administration, the reductions include reduced staff by 1 administrative position related to safety and training, and those duties will be distributed to other administrative staff within the department. We've got the reduced allocation for services of the department. And this proposal also includes a significant reduction in non-personnel or discretionary spending. And some examples of this include professional services, training, supplies. I will note later in the presentation where it may include outside contracts or other materials or equipment. And I will move to the next slide, please. Our fleet operations, just as a quick reminder, is an internal service fund whereby we charge for our services to each of the departments for the fleet they need to use. The 2021 budget proposal includes a 6% reduction in personnel, which includes mechanic positions that are currently unfilled. We also are including in this proposal an 8% reduction in non-personnel, which is attributed to reduced fuel, parts, rental contracts, and of course discretionary spending, as you'll see in each category. A note about fuel here. We are going to purchase less fuel for 2021, and we also have fuel savings because of our work to transition to hybrid and electric vehicles, which is contributing to our ability to save on our fuel purchases. Can go to the next slide, please. In this consolidated program area of planning, design, and engineering, we were able to reduce general fund expenses by reducing one full-time position, a planner, within transportation planning, and also to creatively think about the work that is being done and how it is best aligned with the fund that is most accurately reflects that work. So we have been able to transition staff that are fully working on capital into the capital fund, and even some of those, half of those positions were able to transition to the capital fund as well, which helps us to reduce our expenses in the general fund, and actually is a good move because it appropriately aligns the work with the capital fund. Reduced discretionary spending accounts for a small reduction here as well, and I know it says 0% compared to the overall. It's not a big percent, but I do want to note that a reduction in this area means that we will not be able to contract out for some specialized services as we have in the past, and this might include things like transportation modeling, where we need to do some predictive modeling for the future. It requires expensive software that is expensive for the city to own and quite simple for us to contract for as just, one item. Also training supplies and those other areas that I've previously noted. Thank you. In transportation operations and mobility, we were similarly able to shift work between general and capital funds. In this area, we looked at work that was related to very capital related activities such as parking meter installation and pole replacement. Those are capital items, as well as work that we perform for other agencies that are a capital nature, and shift full-time resources to the capital fund. Despite our ability to realign activity, in total, an 11% change in personnel, only a portion of that is a move to capital, the rest of that is a reduction. And unfortunately, that will be an area where I'd like to highlight that may be felt by the public. We do anticipate some impacts to routine maintenance and repair efforts, such as sign repair or striping. Critical emergency repairs will be done, no impact there. We will have to plan on some adjustments to the time that it takes to respond to 311 complaints and other requests such as traffic calming or bollard replacement or traffic evaluations that are requested by the community. I want to note here that we have been receiving near record number of requests for evaluations this year. We get between 7,000 and 9,000 311 requests per year, in addition to what comes through your offices or through our offices. Our response is very often dependent on the number of requests that we are receiving, and with near record requests coupled together with a reduction in our staff, we are going to see some deferral and delay on some of those activities. Transportation maintenance. I want to note here, and I appreciated having the opportunity to see Director Keller's presentation. She's a close colleague, and I really appreciate how she presented her the work of her group. And I had made some notes for myself about the transportation maintenance group because they are considered the emergency response lead for the Department of Public Works. And they worked tirelessly through the summer, along with crews from solid waste and recycling and traffic to support a widespread cleanup and I will say kind of stabilization of our city this summer. This is an incredibly dedicated team. We know them so much for snow, and they're fabulous out at that, but really they are a broad-based group of professionals who can tackle so much in the way of response in our community, and I believe that was felt by our community, and I have a deep appreciation for that work. The proposed base cuts in transportation maintenance include reduced levels of service in the non-safety related activities. Safety related activities will, again, similar to traffic, be handled immediately, as will emergency response. Some of these areas of reduced work we'll see in the seal coating and crack sealing programs, as well as a reduction in winter service levels throughout the operation. This is another area that I'd like to point out that the public may experience these service level cuts, and most acutely in winter. As you may remember from previous years, our snow budget has been based on a 5-year average, and this helps us to account for variations in weather patterns year to year. The 5-year average for the last 5 years is $12 million, with 2018 and 2019 increasing over the previous years, and our proposed budget for this year is $10.6 million. What that means is that we'll have less ability to call in overtime, which means that our ability to address problem areas or special requests, I anticipate that will be diminished. Our alley plowing may occur less frequently as we need to prioritize resources for access, emergency access. And I do want to note here that our ability to perform expedited corner clearing has remained a priority, and which was added to our budget last year, remains unchanged. And we are committed to completing that work. One of the other ways that you'll see on the screen here that we have a 12% reduction in non-personnel. And one of the ways that we're achieving that kind of reduction is by deferring the maintenance on some of our equipment, and also deferring the replacement of some equipment that we had planned, purchases that we had planned to make in 2021 that we won't be making in 2021. Okay, the last thing I'll cover today, and I feel like I'm getting through this in record time, and I anticipate you will have questions for me. The last item for today is the proposed utility fees for 2021. I am very pleased to report that we're proposing no increase to rates in drinking water and solid waste and recycling. Solid financial management has put us in a strong position, and we're able to be sensitive to the financial burdens that many in our community are feeling during this downturn. We've worked hard to keep these rates flat for 2021. In the Stormwater Fund, we are able to minimize this increase to 1%, which is needed to cover the cost of repairing an aging system and to manage the effects of localized flooding as a result of climate change. And the 2021 proposal must inevitably include a 7% increase in the Sanitary Fund, primarily to cover the increased Metropolitan Council environmental services charges for regional wastewater collection. Last year, we had planned for a $1.8 million increase in the 2021 Met Council rates. Due to a very wet year and increased usage, the actual increase from the Met Council for 2021 is $4.3 million. And that is what is behind that 7% increase in the Sanitary Sewer Fund. This concludes my budget presentation for the mayor's proposed 2021 budget. I want to say too that we'll be on hand for questions related to the capital budget, which follows next, and as you know, is a very large part of Public Works activities. Thank you very much for this time to present, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Director. You're getting a big thumbs up from Council Vice President Jenkins. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano, and thank you, Director Hutchison. I know that this is not a fun budget in that we're talking about service level reductions. We're talking about some very difficult decisions, and you know, I think this is a very sort of thoughtful presentation. I think for us as policymakers to make sure that we understand what we're voting on and make sure that we can communicate to our constituents, you know, what this looks like. I wonder if we can drill down a little bit more on what the service level cut is. I think there was sort of a big list of cuts around like graffiti, mowing, a lot of the kind of responsive work that we do. And I guess I want to help people understand what's the service level cut that we're talking about. Are we talking about it taking a couple extra days to get to something like that? Are we talking about those things just not happening anymore?
Yeah.
You know, what's the actual impact that people are going to feel? And then I guess I would ask the same thing about snow removal. Like, we're still doing snow removal. We maybe aren't getting to alleys as quickly or to some of the cleanup and touch up work. But if you could just elaborate a little bit on what the service level impact is so that we can both make judgments about our comfort level with that as we move forward in the budget process and also communicate that out to our constituents.
Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Fletcher, I'm going to answer that question by talking about 3 different categories. The first category is emergency responses and safety, and there will be no service level change to emergency responses and safety issues in the field. Just want to say that very clearly. The second type of level of service change will be delay. And you noted this. We don't anticipate eliminating any activity, but there may be delay in our ability to respond to something. It's not possible for me to give you an exact, hour or day or week delay because our response often is tied to the volume that we are receiving. And as you know, sometimes we have a short backlog, sometimes we have a long backlog. But things that traditionally would take a certain amount of time, we can anticipate there will be some delay. And some example items of delay would be a delay in there's a need to take a look at an intersection that may need some attention. There's a delay in a non-emergency 311 request that's come in. The difference between safety and not safety, 311 request, there's a stop sign missing, we're going to go out and fix that right away. That's a safety issue. 311 request, there's a crooked sign on my street. Can you come and make it straight? I mean, these are like very typical common things we get in public work that we don't frequently talk about, but it is a good way for me to explain to you what delay means when we say delay. The last category is in deferral or things that we won't be able to do. We have noted things that we plan to do in 2021, such as purchases that we'll do hopefully in 2022. That's an example of a deferral. I would also put something like alley plowing in somewhere between delay and deferral. We are going to plow alleys, no doubt. We may have to choose not to plow if we only get an inch or 2 and delay that plowing until the snow accumulates more in order to reduce the expenditure on that contract that we have for alley plowing. I want to be clear too that we are absolutely plowing snow. That is a critical function for this city. And I anticipate that we will be able to complete snow emergencies within the level of service that we have previously completed in the time frame. So I don't anticipate we'll have a time frame difference in the snow emergency. But I'll give a few examples. After snow emergencies or just generally in snow plowing, we very frequently get special requests to come back and look at areas. We get special requests for, there's a very large windrow that residents are having trouble navigating. That's where we're going to likely see a reduced or delayed ability to get to those issues. We are going to take care of our city, but residents may need to be more patient as we get to the items that they bring forward to us. Does that help? I have additional detail I can share. I don't know if this is the setting for it.
It does help. Thank you. Obviously,
Okay.
that's going to be the content of the conversation as we move forward. We'll be digging into some of those details, but I appreciate that overview. I think
Yeah,
that
it's an
helps.
overview. I do have such detail as reducing our seal coating and crack sealing. We'll do minimal seal coating on residential routes. It used to be 1 to 2 areas per year. We'll only be doing MSA routes and trunk highways, and that relates to the crack sealing. And we've got, kind of a long list of ways that we're going to be delaying or continuing on delaying or deferring, and we can provide you with that additional detail.
Thank you. Chair Palmisano, if nobody else is getting it, I have one more question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I know that some of the gains we've made in fuel consumption are as a result of purchases we've made in fleet to get more modern vehicles. I know that we're delaying purchases in fleet. To what extent are we making sacrifices in our climate goals in order to make the budget work? And what's the impact in terms of our investments in cleaner, newer technology being delayed?
Chair Palmisano, Councilmember Fletcher, that's an excellent question, and I'll start by saying that I happen to need to do some wet signatures together with our fleet director this morning, and so we were talking about this budget presentation, and he said, "Hey, I've got a really great number if you want to share it." And I didn't know I would have the opportunity to, but I will. We one example of how we've made gains in our cleaner vehicles and how that comes out in our budget is, as I mentioned, reducing the amount of fuel that we need to buy. We purchased 36 police squads over the last couple of years as hybrid, and we're seeing tremendous savings in the amount of fuel that they are using, and we plan to purchase 30 more in 2021 as part of this budget. I don't anticipate a prolonged effect on our ability to achieve our goals for a greener fleet. We have had to pull back for 2021, but we remain committed over in 2021 and over the time horizon, 10 years, that our replacement vehicles will be electric for sedans and light duty trucks. So I don't anticipate a big impact in that to 2021. And I think as we look out in 5 and 10 years, I don't anticipate any impact to our ability to reach our goals there.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for asking the very thing that will be on most residents' minds, I think, which would be a slower plow cycle. People are already feeling fairly isolated in their homes. Those that can work from home are, but I think that will help us to try to set meaningful levels of expectations with residents accordingly. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and those were great questions. I think it's worth following up, and maybe for time's sake at committee in detail, about this question around neighborhood traffic calming and the requests that we get from constituents about safety on their streets. I think we've made huge progress in taking a more systematic and citywide approach to that, and the Transportation Action Plan is coming for approval. So we have that more system-wide approach to safety. But as you noted, we still hear so much from folks' interest in their, in what's happening on their block and in their street and in their neighborhood. So I think it's worth understanding how those two approaches are fitting together. And again, invite any comments you might have here about that, as well as maybe a follow-up at committee soon.
Chair Palmisano, Council President Bender, thank you for that question. We spend a lot of time in Public Works talking about the safety of our streets, how residents and businesses perceive it, and how we have made changes to the way and improvements to the way that we consider it as well. And one of the tools that we have is our Vision Zero Action Plan. The Vision Zero Action Plan identifies the most dangerous streets in our city. And if we will focus first on the most dangerous areas of our city, and there will be no change to the way that we address the streets that are identified in the Vision Zero Action Plan. And that's something that you'll see in the Capitol as well. A lot of our street work is wrapped up in Capitol. As I mentioned, there's 7,000 to 9,000 requests for service, and a certain portion of those are related to street safety. And that is an area where I anticipate we'll be able to do a little bit less for 2021 on the evaluation and installation, but I don't. That is not a reflection on the way that we're prioritizing that work. We do have that Vision Zero Action Plan to rely on to make the biggest difference we can out in the community.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to follow up with additional information and detail. As Director Keller noted, sometimes it's not as easy to provide you with a straightforward answer on the fly because, again, our response is very often related to the volume that comes in, and that fluctuates from day to month to year.
Thank you. And I don't know if you heard my glowing invocation of Public Works approach to change that we used as a model for reg services, but thank you for all the work that you and your team are doing. You've adapted so quickly to changing circumstances this summer, and I see this also as a real model within our city enterprise as a way that a department has shifted their work. You have a very large department to really align with our goals around race equity and climate change, and it really matters. It's just seen every day in the work that your staff are doing. So thank you to everyone at Public Works who's out on the streets, who's in their home, keeping this work going.
Thank you, Council President.
As I briefly pause to see if other of my colleagues might get in queue, Director, could we talk about water for just a moment? You had your utilities slide up, and I am extremely impressed that I think, if I remember that slide correctly, it looks like we're keeping our drinking water utility fees flat. I know and appreciate the vast shift in how we use water as a city since the global health pandemic and the different ways that seamlessly our water team has been able to keep up with that shift. My understanding, in one of our shortfalls that we were dealing with when we had to make a budget adjustment back in July, was that this fund, or rather the revenues that we get from drinking water in our city, are so much down because of the difference in the influx of people into downtown for working during the week, into restaurants not being open, and in so many other things. Could you help us understand a little bit about how you were able to achieve this flat rate change? Because I think it looks very unremarkable in your presentation, but it does feel to me like it would be quite a feat.
Chair Palmisano, we love getting questions about water. It's one of our most critical functions as a city. I'm going to answer it in two ways. First way is that when we were first looking at our budgets, it was just after COVID. It was probably June, which is kind of pretty hot weather. Okay. And we were seeing some shifts in how water was being used. We have tracked it very closely, and indeed, we have not seen a significant drop off. We're a little behind, but not as we were concerned it would lag, and it really did not in the way that we feared it would. Our reports are delayed a bit as we get the information back, and so we're waiting on the next quarter's report. But it appears that we are only a very small amount below where we had projected we would be. And, you know, hot summer months play a big role in that. So what we saw in June looked very different by the time we got to September and October. So that is one way we're able, but we've started working on these rates some time ago, even as we were seeing, concerned this summer, and we set a goal to keep all of our utility rates flat. It's one way Public Works can help our community. The water fund is so well managed, carefully managed financially. We have had a healthy cash balance. We have major capital work that is on schedule and on budget. And it makes us very financially solid and stable, such that we can take a year and keep our rates flat. I cannot promise that for 5 years, but I do think that 2021 is going to be a difficult year, and it's something that we were able to do within the fund for this year.
Thank you. I guess I should have also mentioned, I believe strongly that we have some of the best drinking water in the whole country. It's something that residents miss when they're in other places, right? Truly, the high quality of our drinking water, I think, is unsurpassed.
Chair Palmisano, we won an award. We're #1 in mid-sized cities in the United States of America. So thank you for that recognition.
Yes, and also thank you for helping us understand this notion that this was an assumption that we made a while back that hasn't quite panned out for other things, but it's also too early to know for sure. Indeed, this slide of the different utility fees is something felt by every resident in our city. So you're absolutely right that keeping these kinds of things flat is a way that we can go a long way to help maintain, or rather at least not increase, any costs for people that live in our city who would pay these fees every month in some way, shape, or form. So thank you. Director, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments from my colleagues, so at this time I'll thank you for this presentation. I'm sure we'll have more questions as we move forward in our budget process, but thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.
We'll move now to hear an overview of our city's capital and debt service obligations. This presentation will be from Mike Ablin, Director Micah Intermill, and Robert Harrison. I'll just let them switch gears here and get themselves on camera.
Great, thank you, Chair Palmisano.
Welcome.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Micah Intermill, City Budget Director, and I'm pleased to share the Mayor's recommended 2021 budget for the capital and debt programs, as well as the 2021 through 2026 capital improvement plan. As the Chair mentioned, I'm joined today by Robert Harrison, our principal budget analyst, who's been instrumental in this year's capital budget development, as well as Mike Ablin, the city's Director of Investments and Debt Management, who will share the details of the city's debt budget for the coming year. Next slide, please. First, I want to highlight some changes that have taken place this year and other aspects related to the capital budget from a process standpoint. Most notably, following a change in ordinance authored by Chair Palmisano, the city has moved to a 6-year capital improvement program. This allows for a longer on-ramp for projects to funnel into programming pipelines for all segments of the capital budget. The need was most apparent with respect to projects funded through the 20-year streets funding plan, as CLIC members have raised concern over the past few years of not having enough choices to meaningfully provide feedback on community priorities through their process. Our intent in adding a 6th year to the plan was to provide more room for CLIC to help influence project timing and prioritization without creating adverse impacts on current work. I'm very happy to report that CLIC has expressed their appreciation for this change, and at least from my vantage point, it seems we've done a good job of meeting the needs and intent of all ordinances, both the CLIC ordinance as well as the 20-year streets funding ordinance, through this adjustment. So that brings me to a short discussion about this year's CLIC process, which some long tenured members have indicated has been perhaps the most challenging in the committee's long history. CLIC was initially scheduled to convene just a few short weeks after the onset of the pandemic. Given competing priorities of adjusting the 2020 budget, we had to hit pause on the CLIC process until midsummer. Members were flexible not only to the change in timing, but also to meeting online in a highly structured setting, which went counter to their more deliberative and free-flowing operational norms. I thank all of the CLIC members for their engagement, patience, and perseverance this year, and in particular want to commend Chair Jeff Strand and Vice Chair Willie Bridges for their invaluable leadership. And the last point on this slide is an important one. As you'll remember, the 2020 adopted budget included an asset management strategy change item. The intent of this program is to systematize and incorporate data from all major city asset categories into one format to aid in budget prioritization, financial reporting, and risk management. We started in on this work right as the year began, and Robert Harrison and I met with counterparts in Washington, D.C. in late February to learn from them directly, as theirs is a model we aim to replicate here in Minneapolis. As with a great number of initiatives in the city, this effort was put on hold while work shifted to responding to the pandemic and ensuing economic and budgetary responses, so we've not been able to make significant progress. However, we've held the concepts with us and intend to continue work next year as time allows. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the second area I want to talk about today and foreshadow a major policy question that lies ahead. To be very clear, action is not necessary in this budget cycle, but it may be as soon as next year. As was discussed under the asset management strategy change item description, city policymakers and CLIC members currently have access to uneven information with regard to asset condition, as well as an overall need for new or updated facilities and infrastructure. A key concept that we discussed with our new friends from Washington was the need to be clear and honest upfront with the level of unmet need that exists with respect to capital programming. This is represented in the chart on the screen by the orange bars, which indicate the total amount of work needed to be completed, which are not matched entirely by blue bars, which represent the available resources under our current debt levy capacity. This year, rather than only including those projects in the 6-year CIP that can be funded, staff recommended and the mayor agreed that we should balance the planned programming in the first 2 years and be upfront about our additional unmet needs beyond what is currently available in years 3 through 6. Much of the over-programming or unmet need relates directly to our public grounds and facilities, that is, the spaces that city staff work in each day. We typically have enough funding available to build one new fire station or police precinct at a time, but our needs currently go well beyond that. The policy question is complex, but it can essentially be boiled down to, should the city invest in a greater level of capital programming in future years beyond our current plans, or should staff look to find alternate ways to deliver services that do not require the construction of new facilities? Some alternatives do exist, and as we've learned now over 6 months into the pandemic, remote work simply works in many cases. In fact, remote work has already led one department to withdraw a request for a new facility from the capital program. Regulatory Services had a request in for 2022 to build a new facility for its inspectors who are currently housed in a lease space on West River Road. Through the spring, it became apparent that these staff could primarily be officed out of their homes with additional hoteling space available at the new downtown office building, with the new downtown office building nearly complete. That saved $5 million out of the capital budget and several hundreds of thousands of dollars from our operating budget. Of course, this example is not easily replicated with police or fire stations, but the point remains that the future may bring new opportunities that help draw down the unmet need without the need to add additional resources. Additionally, the 2021 capital budget includes funding for pre-design for a number of public grounds and facilities projects that don't show up for construction funding until later in the plan. This is an intentional move championed by our new Property Services Director, Barbara O'Brien, to build a library of projects on the shelf that can be tapped as soon as funding becomes available. It allows us to better scope and size projects to meet programming needs, and it helps generate better and more complete data to be included in future planning years, as what's included now is a set of broader estimates. Finally, and importantly, off-ramps to the current plan are inherently embedded within it. The level of unmet need could be reduced by delaying or deferring many projects, and the magnitude of projects that do not commence until 2023 and beyond is roughly equal to the size of the unmet need. So policymakers could choose to stay the course, and it would be workable from a finance perspective, though it would certainly have impacts on programming and general conditions of our infrastructure. Again, the intent today is to introduce the topic for future conversation, and that's a conversation that I look forward to having with all of you. Next slide, please. With that, I'll turn it over to Robert Harrison, who will talk through the capital programming at a high level.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, Chair Palmisano, members of the Budget Committee. For the record, I am Robert Harrison. I'm the budget analyst assigned to the city's capital improvement program, among a couple of other areas. As with last year, with this presentation, what we're going to do is take a look at the resources required under the 6-year plan. We'll also take a quick look at some of the projects included in the plan from the various divisions, departments, and boards of the city. So with that, we could move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So this slide shows, on the left here, this shows the different programming levels across the years of the plan. On the right, it shows the total amount of program by the major department or area that will be delivering the projects. You know, in total, we're seeing across the 6 years of the plan, just shy of $1.3 billion of funding required for the plan. Because this year's 6-year capital program spans years 21 through 26, and last year's 5-year program spanned years 2020 through 24. One of the challenges that we're faced with this morning is finding a way to succinctly and coherently convey the changes between those two rolling plans over time. But if I could begin, I think one of the ways we'd like to characterize some of the changes that we're seeing is an overall expansion in the capital program from the plan that we saw last year to the plan that we saw this year. I think I can highlight some of the key differences in this slide by looking at years 2020 through 2024 in particular. Last year, we saw funding levels that generally fell below the $200 million mark that we're seeing here on the slide. And in this slide, we're seeing in 2023, 25 and 26 funding levels are they are crossing that line, and that really reflects some of the unmet need that Director Intermill was referring to at the beginning of this presentation. I should mention that there's nothing magic about the $200 million mark. It's just the gauge that I can use with this slide to kind of show where we're seeing some of the differences. Another key difference that we're seeing this year compared to last year's program is really related to the just the increased demand for investment across our different asset categories. A lot of that is coming through this capital program this year. Arguably, we've always had that level of unmet demand, or we've at least always had a certain amount of unmet demand. But this year, we're really pulling the veil back on that figure and showing some more of that demand for capital with this presentation. The pie chart at the right, again, this probably echoes something that Director Hutchison just referred to. The largest share is certainly the public works share, but this of course comprises transportation improvements, water treatment and distribution projects, sanitary and stormwater sewer projects as well. Overall, that comprises about 84 or 85% of the total capital program. We have public grounds and facilities projects. Those are police precincts, fire stations, various other improvements to city-owned facilities, maybe 8 or 9% of the overall program. Park board as well as maybe 5 or 6% of the program. With that, I can step over to the next slide, which focuses on the 2021 budget year. This is the appropriation year that's associated with the capital program, i.e. the only year that we're actually appropriating funding for. The remaining 5 years of the capital program are, well, they're absolutely programmed, but we're not necessarily coming forward with appropriation for those. It's a busy slide. It's informative. You know, on the left, we've got the different major categories of capital investments. The different colors reflect different revenue sources that, you know, tend to be associated with those investments. And on the right, we show those revenue sources in proportion to each other in that pie chart. I've taken to thinking of this overall slide as, you know, maybe a good breakdown for the city's tax and ratepayers, because it shows that if, for instance, you're paying property taxes, you're likely contributing at least a certain portion toward these blue projects that we're seeing here: transportation improvements, park board improvements, public grounds and facilities improvements, and to a certain extent, enterprises, municipal building commission, and art and public places projects as well. Likewise, if you're paying a water bill or other utility fees, you're going to be contributing toward these green projects, which are associated with public works' various enterprises. We're including a gray category with this presentation. These are really, you know, one-time funding sources, grant funding, municipal state aid is rolled into this category, and of course, those are amounts that are collected for motor vehicle sales taxes, motor fuel taxes as well, collected to the state and distributed back to the city via formula funding for reinvestment across our transportation system. Those gray bars also include certain amounts of cash that are associated with the 20-year streets funding plan. I'll touch on that a little bit in the next slide, but before leaving this one, I really wanted to highlight that this is what we could describe as a typical funding mix for the city's capital program. We're likely to see these sources of funding again. These sources of funding were present by and large last year, and they're more or less integrated into the capital program in years going forward. The amounts may certainly fluctuate and fluctuate significantly over time, but this is the stable mix of funding that we see across our capital program. I'll step to the next slide now. The next slide is going to be on the 20-year streets plan. If we could step over to the next slide. The 20-year streets program, again, it allocates a certain amount of resources toward the city's capital improvement program. I'm not seeing the slide deck switch over at this point, but I can certainly provide a recap. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So these are the amounts that have been added to the city's capital improvement program for neighborhood parks and streets projects under the 20-year Parks and Streets plan that was approved in 2016. You can see that across the 6 years of this capital improvement program, we're adding about $193 million. These amounts are reflected in the slides that we saw before in the total funding amounts. And you know, in case the question comes up, these amounts are fully integrated and being fully utilized as part of our capital planning process here at the city. Comprises net debt bond funding, stormwater transfers for stormwater elements across capital projects, certain amount of general funding or transfers from the general fund as well. We can see in 2021 that general fund cash amount increases. That is as planned when the original 20-year Parks and Streets plan was produced in order to ensure stable funding for increased levels of capital investment. There was a planned increase in the general fund portion of the plan related to or timed to coincide with the expiration of a consolidated tax increment financing district. And so we're seeing that come online as the district goes away. So we're not seeing any additional net upward pressure on the levy as a result of that. We do track the use of these resources, and we generally try and report back on them via this format, certainly. And we also want to recognize that the Public Works Department also brings back reports each year on the actual outcomes as a result of this additional level of funding too, just to kind of connect the dots. And that's typically If I recall correctly, that's typically around the summer timeframe that those reports come out. So I can step on to the next slide, if you could. I think this really captures the summary of the resources that are needed for this 6-year program. In the next couple of slides, I'd like to recap some of the different project funding categories that we've included as part of that we break out as part of the capital program. These are, of course, projects that are submitted to the city via capital budget requests, or at least submitted to the Capital Long Range Improvement Committee as capital budget requests. That committee reviews these projects, and then eventually a capital program is compiled that is advanced through this capital process. And these following slides contain those mix of projects that are being advanced and are tying out to the resources that are required in the preceding slides. So if we could step to the next slide, please. It'll be on the Municipal Building Commission. Yep. And this is, for 2021, we can see that the MBC has planned budget of $9.2 million across several projects, across 3 projects here that they've received appropriation in prior years. They've got some appropriation plan going forward as well. As Director Aaron Delaney has presented to the city in the past, these are of course improvements to the City Hall facility. Investments in the City Hall facility are shared jointly between the county and the city, and these funding amounts here present the total investment that's split between the 2 entities. If we could move to the next slide. We'll be on the Park Board. Of course, the Park Board is coming to present on their budget this afternoon, but here we see the full list of Park Board projects that are included in the 6-year capital improvement program, totaling $12.913 million or so in 21, and $77.7 million across the full 6-year program. Here is where we have highlighted in the past that some of these projects are certainly discrete. Some of them are more programs of projects that involve different components. There's a playground and site improvements program here that comprises different specific improvements across the city, budgeted for $1.2 million in 21 and $7.6 million across the full program. I should also mention, as we did last year, that parkways are not shown in this list of projects. That is included actually in the Public Works portfolio of projects. And as we noted last year, as I learned via last year's process, the city endeavors to keep parkway paving at comparable conditions to those of the rest of the city streets. However, the Park Board is responsible for any major rehabilitation type projects of parkway facilities. I can step to the next slide, please. This will be on the Public Works set of projects. Of course, there's too many to list on any one slide, so we do what we've done in past years, and we kind of highlight the top 10 projects by purely by dollar value. These total $58.4 million in 21, close to $370 million across the full 6 years, and it comes pretty near to 35% of the department's overall capital program. Again, this is a mix of different program type projects as well as discrete projects. We have asphalt pavement resurfacing, concrete streets rehabilitation, and water distribution improvements, which are ongoing programs that address investment needs across the city. Then we have more singular discrete projects like Central City Parallel Storm Tunnel, the Dowling Avenue project, and Nicollet Avenue or Minnehaha Creek here are single, are larger projects that are going through the plan. In preparing the presentation this year, I did want to highlight that this set of projects that we see here really is typical of that funding mix that we talk about earlier in this presentation, because across all of these projects, you're really seeing that mix of reasonably reliable, stable funding sources being brought to bear in order to deliver the capital program. You've got projects in here that will rely on net debt bond funding sources, potentially, although I would need to confirm, but potentially assessments as well. Projects in here that are associated with our utilities, the storm tunnel project, water distribution projects. Off-street parking systems is going to be associated with revenues that are coming off of the city's parking system. So you really do see that full mix of resources that's being drawn into and supporting the Public Works Capital Program via this slide. I can step on to the next slide. I only have 2 more, I promise. We have public grounds and facilities. This comprises the mix of facilities that the city owns and invests in and maintains. For example, police precincts are contained in this category, fire stations as well. We have solar power projects being incorporated into the plan this year, as well as some additional components of the City Hall and new public service building project as well. Of course, the project is the new public service building project is I don't know how to characterize it correctly, mostly complete, if not fully complete. But we still have the City Hall components of this set of projects that needs additional appropriation too. Those are coming forward this year. I would characterize these projects as heavily dependent on net debt bond funding. They haven't, in my limited experience, they haven't tended to have access to other unique funding sources, and so these projects fall within the core funding need that we're experiencing with the city's net debt bond program. I can step forward to the next slide, please. All right, this is our last category, miscellaneous projects. Really, it contains one project these days, and that's the city's art and public places project by ordinance. If you'll recall, this is 1.5% of the city's net debt bond program, and these amounts tie out to that 1.5% calculation. That's the end of my rundown of the city's various capital project categories. I think we could move to the next slide, where I will turn the presentation over to Director Mike Ablin. Mike Ablin is the city's Director of Investments and Debt Management, and we'll cover, as in past years, how we really issue and pay for the debt that supports so many, if not most, of our capital program.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I'm not seeing any questions or comments about your part of the presentation, so we can transition over to Mr. Ablin. Welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Micah and Robert, for the introduction, and I will request the next slide, please. So a lot of what we heard so far has been about unmet needs, and the net debt bond program is typically that category where more resources allow for more projects. So before I talk about the debt, I wanted to introduce this concept of this levy being the primary source. The rest of my presentation is going to focus on the debt service and the outstanding debt of the city, and how these bonds fit into some of the expense that follows on afterwards that we levy for to pay for. So next slide, please. So Micah and Robert have talked about the levy. This slide shows the previous 5 years of the program from 16 through 20. You can see there those amounts total about 201 million, or a little over 40 million per year on average. And then the next slides show an increase. Again, this is kind of, go back to the previous slide, please. These intervals from 21 through 26 show the growing levy. This levy needs to provide for both principal and interest on the bonds. And so you can basically provide something of new spending that's associated with these levies, although these levies also have to cover interest. So if you look at 21 through 25, think of it as we can't really do $47 million worth of projects. We have to do something less than that, because on average we have to include dollars for paying interest expense. So the total for the first 5 years of this program compared to the previous 5 years is about 249 million, or about a 9.6 million on average increase over the previous 5 years. And that's a result of the 20-year streets and parks plan, and the city's commitment to increasing its capital spending, and therefore this levy to help pay for it. Down at the bottom, we see the levy for the library. This levy is going to go away for the libraries, and it's going to be picked up for debt service on the public service public service center and the city hall improvements. So 2021 is the last year for the market value referendum. Next slide, please. So this picture is a picture of our total outstanding debt at the city over the last 10 years. You can see that our debt has come down through 2015, 16, and now it's starting to rise again. In 2017, we started to issue the first debt for the 20-year streets and parks plan, which also had an increase in our capital programming. And so you can see that debt start to rise a little bit again. Every year we pay off a lot of debt, as we'll see in some of the following slides, but we put a lot of new debt on the books for funding capital improvements. Some of the bigger increase there you see from 2018 to 19 reflects debt that was incurred for the new public service center. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on some of the future slides. Next slide, please. So this is basically showing that outstanding debt and where the debt is currently by functions. So of the 742 million of general obligation debt, 262 plus million of that is for the enterprise funds. They're very capital intensive, obviously. Of that particular amount, roughly half of that, a little over half of that is associated with the water function. So the water distribution and treatment enterprise is the biggest debt incurring, longest lived assets, and very costly to keep that system vibrant and working and producing that good water that Chair Palmisano talked about. Convention Center Fund, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, 26 million outstanding there. And then the Target Center renovation project, that debt is all the sales tax backed portion of the debt for the Target Center. The other portion of that debt was tax increment financed from its original inception back in 1995. That debt got paid off so that we don't have any of that type of debt any longer. The tax increment category there is only $1.5 million of general obligation debt, but you see the note that we do have a little over 13 million in an internal loan. So about a year ago, we paid off the bonds that the public investors held because they were callable, and we took that in as an investment in the city and made it an internal loan that we will be paying off over time. Special assessment debt, 60.73 million. This debt fluctuates with how many road improvements we're doing, and so this has kind of been going up because the streets and parks program, especially the streets portion of that, is in fact doing more projects, and therefore that leads to a larger number of assessments. So we may see this particular category of debt go up over time. And then the Park Board and Downtown East category is primarily Downtown East is about 61 million of that, and the other part is Park Board for Parade Stadium and some of their enterprise functions. The library referendum debt, we issued debt in October. It was the last debt. It was a refunding issue. It put this debt all out due and payable in 2021, and at that point, on December 1 of next year, the library debt will be fully defeased, and that's where that levy will shift and be used for the public service center bonds. And then the net debt in public service center bonds, you can see from 2004, that's up quite a bit. It's kind of a misnomer there. About 182 million of that is related to the new public service center. That's the total debt issued for that facility. We are at the point where that is the final amount of debt that will be issued, and about 68 million of that debt is net debt. So that's kind of the outstanding debt. You can see the footnote that says in 2004 we had 1.299 billion of debt, including some pension bonds and internal service fund bonds. So if you think of it from 2004 till now, we're actually down $557 million of debt for the city, which really is pretty good considering how much we've done in new capital improvements over that time frame as well. So it's a reflection of, you know, your commitment to manage the finances. It helps us with our bond ratings significantly by keeping our debt manageable and aggressively structured, which we'll see in the following debt service slides. But that's sort of the total debt picture of outstanding debt. Next slide, please. So this is our 2021 debt service budget. So this is same functional breakdowns, and here's how much principal and interest will be paid next year on this debt. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Again, the bigger categories like the enterprise funds have a lot of that debt service expense. And then the net debt bonds area is large because there's a lot of projects rolling through that system. So we have a lot of currently structured bonds, and we add a lot of new bonds each year to that. And we do that structure very aggressively in correspondence with those levies. So it's kind of a flow through process that happens year after year after year. And so that total of 48 million there, you know, is somewhat tied to the bond redemption levy, as well as which projects are going and, you know, how the debt structure changes as we issue new bonds. The rest of the categories I'm not going to talk too much about. One thing I didn't mention is the HIA program there with special assessments. That's a homeowner improvement association program. The city has done 3 projects for that program, and that program assists like condo developments with improvements to their properties. Sometimes they have a difficult time getting financing through banks, traditional bank financing, and then the city can help with that, and it ends up being like a special assessment. It's called a user fee, but it's collected on property taxes, much like a special assessment. So there's 3 projects totaling about $6 million in that program. So you can see about 80% principal, about 20% interest. That's fairly typical of our city debt, which basically indicates a fairly aggressive pay down and amortization of our debt over time as all these programs are flowing through the process of new debt added and existing debt on the books. We tend to be paying about 80% towards principal and 20% towards interest. So total budget of about 120 million for 2021. Okay, next slide, please. The city has 2 variable rate notes outstanding right now, totaling about 29.3 million. One of them is associated with the riverfront parking ramp down by the Guthrie Theater, and about 2.1 million of that is associated with the Nicollet Mall project. Interest rates on this debt fluctuate either weekly or monthly, and they're in the range right now with our 2 programs of, you know, about 0.5% to 1.38%. So it's very cost-effective debt, but we are also at a low in the interest rate environment. So if the interest rate environment does in fact go up, which it's not predicted to do anytime soon, these rates could go up. But it's only about 4% of our general obligation debt. Just as an aside, Part of the reason the city was able to pay off the libraries as quickly as we have been able to is we did have a lot of the funding for the improvements to the community libraries and central library were in variable rate mode for quite a long time. And during that time, interest rates were very, very low. So we were able to aggressively pay off that principal, which cut literally over a decade off of the original estimates for that debt. Next slide, please. So I said I'd talk a little bit about the Convention Center series. As everybody's aware, the COVID situation has led to the Convention Center not being able to host conventions, pro sporting events, etc., have caused a significant reduction in local sales tax revenues. And so as a result of that, we were supposed to pay off our Convention Center debt on December 1 of 2020, the last $26 million installment. But it was determined that really the best thing for that was to issue debt to refund that maturity. And so what we did is we issued the same amount of debt. And the structure is a bullet, or all the amount is due on 12/1 of 25. So we gave ourselves about 5 years. But those bonds are callable as early as a couple years from now. Our current finance plan is looking at structuring and being able to pay hopefully $6.5 million per year or something like that, or whatever we can if in fact business improves and we can pay it off quicker. It's very cost-effective debt at 0.6% interest rate. So for a year of debt service on this, it's literally $156,000. And in the meantime, that money had it been removed from our city's cash pool and paid off the debt, it wouldn't be earning interest that is then allocated to funds as well. So really, cost-wise, it's almost a break even, because we can earn probably more than that 0.6% on our unused money in the meantime. So I think it was a good move for the city to do that, and it's given us a lot of flexibility. We would have had the money to pay that off. There is enough cash in the Convention Center fund, but had we paid it off, it would have left our reserve balances minimally adequate, I would say. And it's much better to have a safer balance, especially not knowing how long COVID-19 implications might last at the city. So I just thought that slide was maybe a way to help folks understand why we did what we did there. I think that's my last slide. If you want to go on, I think that's the end of the presentation. So any questions from anybody, I'd be happy to handle, or if there's any on the capital program, folks are still around. Thank you.
I like that you say 4 conclusions that we might draw from your slides. I don't know that we want to go that far just yet, but it's a part of our process. I'll invite my colleagues to put themselves in queue for some conversation around this. And I think that we could go, I think that in our old traditional committee structure or model, we could go very deeply into some of these decisions and draw other conclusions, right? Or question whether or not some of this is the right strategy for now. But at this point in time, you're a steward of that work, and we certainly appreciate it, and we appreciate you. I know we will have more conversations about this, especially as it pertains to our asset management strategy from way earlier in the presentation. Have started to have some preliminary conversations with colleagues about that, and just from the need to address it, to be good forward thinkers and have the financial future of our city close in mind as we put together these budgets and these 6-year budgets. I don't see any questions or comments from my colleagues, so I'll just thank you for your time and thank your team, Director Intramural Robert Harrison, for your time. I will direct the clerk at this point to file all of the presentations that we've heard this morning, so Regulatory Services, Public Works, and this city's capital and debt service obligations presentations. And then, colleagues, I will recess this meeting until 1:30 when we will hear the budget presentations from our Park and Recreation Board, from the Youth Coordinating Board, and our Finance and Property Services Department. Thank you, everyone. We're going to recess until 1:30.